Good morning and welcome to Tuesdays with the Pilgrim as we continue reading The Bishop Who Ate His Boots with Chapter 4, Part A. Furlough and Marriage. The first stage of Stringer's journey from Herschel Island to his Ontario home was made on the steamer Jeanie, a whaler under the command of Captain P.H. Mason. The vessel weighed anchor and left the island on the afternoon of Thursday, September 5th, 1895, saluted by the whistles and flags of the remaining ships. This, as Stringer remarked in his diary, was the beginning of his first long voyage. It was not to be his last. 2 days later, the ship passed Point Barrow, the most northerly tip of Alaska, and anchored off Cape Smith. On the following morning, the missionary went ashore in a native canoe and found a fairly large settlement. Quote, "There are 4 establishments, Mr. Stevenson's, which is a Presbyterian mission. Mr. S. is a schoolteacher and built a nice house last year. Mr. Kelly, who works for the Pacific Steam Whaling Company, has several houses, most of them old. Mr. Atkins is in charge of the government refuge station. The buildings are commodious and comfortable. Lieberg Company has another station with several houses." Unquote. The mission with its school was established in 1890. After the visit, the voyage continued. Stringer was now beginning to feel that a long sea voyage was not without its difficulties. He conducted a service on board on Sunday, but complained of feeling seasick. For several days, the Jeanie continued her way through the rolling waters of the Arctic, much to the discomfort of her passenger, who divided his time between laying on his bunk and walking the deck. He felt better on deck, but for much of the time the cold rain drove him below. After 5 days at sea, the ship anchored for a few hours off Point Hope, Alaska. 2 men came aboard to transact business with the captain, and the missionary of the Episcopal Church came to meet Isaac Stringer. He was the Reverend A.N. Edson. The permanent missionary, Dr. John B. Driggs, had very recently gone out on furlough on the U.S. revenue cutter Bear. Edson told some of his problems and difficulties. A runner, he said, had come from Kotzebue Sound, announcing that a man there had risen from the dead, and had said that, while in heaven, he had learned that Edson's teaching was all wrong, and that they should not attend his meetings. Soon, said the risen one, the Messiah would come, and they should all wait for him. Naturally, all of this was having a bad effect on the work of the mission. Edson thought that in reality the story had originated at Point Hope, where the Eskimos attributed their misfortunes in whaling and the sickness and death of their children to the missionary. A similar superstition had occurred among the Hareskin Indians near Fort Good Hope on the Mackenzie River some 20 years earlier. There, the Indians, who had been adherents of the Roman Catholic mission, suddenly stopped attending Mass, began to work on Sundays, and to disregard all that they had been taught about the Christian faith. The priest was puzzled and distressed until at last an Indian woman explained the matter to him. Quote, "When the barges came from Portage la Loch, our men told us that they had seen a man who had risen from the dead. This man, who had died a year ago, had spent the winter with Almighty God, the Great Spirit, who sent him back to earth to complain of the priests who were giving God too much work to do. Owing to the priests, God had no time to either smoke or eat, and he wished it to be made known that it was very wrong not to work on Sunday, and that when the priest said Mass, heaven became dark and God Almighty was displeased." Unquote. It is possible that in both instances the hearers had misunderstood warnings which had been given concerning rival teachings by their opponents. Poor Edson, relieved by having been able to pour out his troubles to a sympathetic listener, returned to his lonely vigil. By the time Jeanie passed through the Bering Strait, Stringer had overcome his seasickness and felt able to climb the mast, remaining in the crow's nest for about 10 minutes. A few days later, they entered Dutch Harbor on Unalaska Island, where they found the cutter Bear at anchor. Stringer was able to meet Dr. Driggs and to learn something of his story. John B. Driggs had been a physician for some years in Wilmington, Delaware, USA, where he heard of the deplorable conditions existing among the Eskimos along the coast of Alaska. He volunteered for service with them and arrived at Point Hope in 1890. He found them full of suspicion and resentment against all white men because of the way they had been treated, and quite unwilling to admit any more whites to their community. It took several hours for the ship's officers to convince the Eskimos that Dr. Driggs was a different kind of white man. He had come to try and heal their bodies, not to exploit them, to help the Eskimos, not to harm them. At length they yielded, and he went ashore and built his house. Slowly he won their confidence and was able to teach them and to minister to both their spiritual and material needs. The first 5 years had proved a severe strain, and now he was on his way out for furlough. After a week in the Aleutian Islands, the whaler continued south. Each Sunday, Stringer held a service on board for those who felt disposed to attend, and usually there were a dozen people present. At each service, if one may judge by the text he used, Stringer gave a very simple, straightforward, evangelistic address. Leaving the Aleutians, the Jeannie steamed into Prince William Sound, where she expected to pick up a cargo of canned salmon. Early one morning the vessel ran ashore, but the crew were able to get her afloat without difficulty, and she continued up the Sound, a deep ford with trees and rocks rising sharply on each side. She arrived at the cannery, only to discover that she had been reported as having wrecked off of Point Barrow. The men and canned salmon had been sent down by an earlier boat. During the stop to take on water, Stringer and some of the others went through the cannery. During the season, about 80 white men were engaged in fishing, and about 140 Chinese worked the cannery itself. This had been a poor summer for fish, and only about 23,000 cases had been shipped. There were piles of unused cases and boxes lying about the premises. The only other incident of note during the voyage was the death of one of the crew, a ship's cook, who had been unwell for some time, and to whom Stringer had been ministering. McCoy had been the cook of the Mary D. Hume. His mother lived in Halifax, and he had a wife in San Francisco, but he had not heard from her for a year or more. He died early one evening, and the captain asked Stringer to conduct a burial service. The body was prepared for burial by being sewn into a sack with iron sinkers attached. The service took place early on the following morning. All the men who could be spared from essential work assembled on deck, and the missionary read the burial office from the Book of Common Prayer. At the words, "We commend his body to the deep," the body, wrapped in its covering, was slid down a board into the sea to descend 400 or 500 fathoms to the ocean floor. As Stringer finished the service, he felt dispirited and distressed that anyone should be thus cast into the deep, unwept, and apparently without friends to mourn him. For much of the voyage, the vessel was shrouded in fog, and San Francisco was reached on October 8th after 33 days at sea. Although he found the trip interesting, he was thoroughly relieved to have his feet on dry land once more. Not long after his arrival, Stringer was comfortably settled at the Brooklyn Hotel. When he went to the office of the Pacific Steam Whaling Company, he was surprised and pleased to discover that they would accept nothing for his passage from Herschel Island. Also at the offices were letters from his family and friends. He read these eagerly and then sent a telegram to his parents informing them of his safe arrival in San Francisco and of his plan to proceed via Vancouver, British Columbia, to Toronto. He spent some weeks in San Francisco sightseeing, making new friends, visiting clergy, addressing meetings, and preaching on his work. He went to see the recently established Church of Divinity School of the Pacific in suburban San Mateo, and visited Stanford University at nearby Palo Alto, where a number of his acquaintances from University of Toronto were teaching. He accepted an invitation from one of them to give a lecture on his work in the North. Stringer went through his collection of photographs and had a number of them made into lantern slides to illustrate the lecture. He felt nervous at first in facing 400 students, but quickly recovered and spoke earnestly of the opportunities and needs of the Eskimo mission. He spent some time at the office of the whaling company discussing with the executives the possibilities of a mission at Herschel Island and urging upon them the need for control of the liquor traffic. The company president assured Stringer he would dismiss any employee found to be supplying liquor to the Eskimos or Indians. The missionary also made inquiries about the feasibility of a steam yacht to facilitate his work, and placed orders for supplies to be sent north in the following spring. Then he left for Canada. On his arrival at Victoria, he heard that the HMS Pheasant was at the dock in Esquimalt, the naval base. As he had met some of the officers and men in the Aleutians on his way from the Arctic, he hurried out to the dockyards to renew their acquaintance. Late on the same night, he took the ferry to Vancouver. Arriving on Sunday morning, he called on the rector of Christ Church, the Reverend L. Norman Tucker, who invited him to take part in the services that day and to preach at evensong. In the afternoon, he visited the Sunday school and spoke to the teachers and children on his work among the Eskimos. At the evening service, he preached to a congregation of 300 people from one of his favorite texts. Quote, "The people that walked in darkness have seen a great light. They that dwelt in the land of the shadow of death, upon them the light has shined." Unquote. Isaiah 9:2. Making special reference to the work in which he was engaged in the Arctic. A week later in Winnipeg he saw old friends, among them Cecil Owen, who was now the rector of Holy Trinity Church. He visited the Stony Mountain Penitentiary again, where he found the faces of the prisoners an interesting study. Some looked honest, while others, he thought, had the stamp of criminals on their faces. After lunch he picked up the Saturday newspaper and saw to his surprise that it was announced he would address the Sunday school at Holy Trinity Church at 4 o'clock that afternoon. Hurriedly he and his host made their way to the church, but they were too late, and the children and their teachers were just coming away. That same evening he preached at Christ Church, noting afterwards in his diary, quote, "Processional singing, surpliced choir. I wore cassock. Eastern position in the creed. I did not conform to the custom." And we'll stop there for this week and continue next week with Chapter 4, Part B. Until then, take care, stay safe, and God bless.